Okay, welcome back. Today we're continuing our review of our first practice exam. If you would like to buy this exam along with our other two practice exams, please check out bcbastudy.com. Questions, comments, let me know. Love to help. As always, work hard, study hard, and let's get to our questions. 161. Birds and kites both evoke the response, things that fly. These three stimuli are known as what? Stimulus class question. So we have response classes and we have stimulus classes. Response classes are responses that meet the same function. Stimulus classes tend to evoke the same responses. So if we have birds and kites evoke the same response, things that fly, what are they considered? Are these arbitrary? Are they features? Or are they consequence classes? Well, we know they're not response classes, right? Because we're looking at the stimuli. The response here is things that fly. They're not consequences, right? They're not consequence classes because they're evoking a response. They're antecedents. So they're going to be arbitrary or feature. Now, let's be careful, okay? Feature, we're looking at some sort of topographical similarity between the two. Okay. Arbitrary, there's not any similarities between the two topographically, but they still evoke the same response. So if birds and kites, which don't have any topographical similarities, evoke the same response, those are going to be arbitrary stimulus classes. 162. David works in an office park, which is an assigned space for everyone who works there. One spot is labeled CEO, but David constantly parks there anyway, but not on purpose. David wants to correct this behavior. He needs to work on what? This is a discrimination/differentiation question. Now, what do we know about discrimination? What do we know about differentiation? Discrimination, also known as stimulus discrimination, is telling the difference between two or more stimuli. Differentiation, also known as response differentiation, is differences between responses. So when you get a question like this, you need to ask yourself, are we looking at different stimuli or are we looking at different responses? Well, the response here is parking, right? He's parking in the assigned space. He's not differentiating between responses. It's the same thing each time, parking. The problem is he doesn't park in the right spot. So one is labeled CEO, one isn't. Two different stimuli, right? He needs to work on discriminating between stimuli. It's not going to be generalization because we're not even there yet. Generalization is going to occur after we teach him. Then maybe we can generalize to other areas of the parking lot. And then prompting, he doesn't need to work on prompting. We might need to develop some prompts to help him discriminate. But what he needs to work on, what David needs to work on, is discrimination between the parking spot that says CEO and the parking spot that doesn't. 163. Of the following, what would be best to do in order to determine a functional relation when using a multiple baseline design? Functional relations. What are we talking about when we say functional relation? Well, we can also refer to it as experimental control or functional control. We want to determine, do we have control over the behavior? Is our intervention the thing controlling the behavior, or is there something else? And when we're using experimental designs, really our primary concern is establishing functional relation or not. This question wants to know, if we're using a multiple baseline design, how are we going to determine a functional relation? Well, let's see. A, you would want to make sure that your baselines are changing in level across settings, subjects, or behaviors. Are our baselines going to help us determine a functional relation? Well, they might disprove a functional relation, but they're not going to really help us determine a functional relation. If our baselines start changing rapidly, okay, that's an issue. We want our baselines to remain steady across settings, subjects, or behaviors, right? This is prior to intervention. We don't want a lot of variability between our baselines. B, you would want to make sure your baselines are variable. Okay, we just answered that, right? We're not looking for a lot of variation in baselines. We don't want level changes, variations, trend changes. We want baselines steady, right? We're not trying to change the baseline. C, you would want to make sure that the behavior changes when the independent variable is applied. Okay, now it's a little tricky because yes, C applies to multiple baseline design, but C applies to anything when you're trying to determine a functional relation. You want to make sure when that independent variable is applied, that behavior is changing, and only when that IV is applied. That's how you determine a functional relation. And then D, you would want to make sure that behaviors are changing at the same pace. That's not relevant. Some might change slower, especially if we're using, let's say, different subjects, okay, or different settings. The behaviors might change at different speeds. As long as they're changing when the IV is introduced, we can determine a functional relation. So our answer here is going to be C. A two-phase design that includes a baseline condition and a treatment condition would be considered what type of design? Don't overthink this. The answer is right in the question. And this is why I'm always telling you, do your work up front. Understand what the question is saying. First off, a two-phase design. We have two phases. What can you immediately eliminate? Well, you can eliminate C, A, B, A, B. It's 4 phases. You can eliminate a withdrawal design. A withdrawal design, by design, has 3 phases, A, B, A. So now we have an SR and an AB design. So we have a baseline condition and a treatment condition. An SR design isn't really a thing to begin with, right? SR would be a stimulus response design. It's not really a thing. Regardless, we know if we're going to have a baseline condition, it could be A treatment condition is going to be B. Since it's a two-phase design that includes baseline and treatment, it's going to be an AB design. So be careful. Withdrawal design is by definition at least 3 phases. We have a baseline, we have an intervention. We withdraw that intervention, return to baseline. If we're not withdrawing it, it's not a withdrawal design or reversal. It's just an AB design. So be careful. 165, how often should IOA be attained? This is kind of a rote question. We don't have a lot of rote questions on the exam, but this one is, right? Because this comes straight from the Cooper book, right? So I know you've probably talked to many people who have different opinions on IOA. I'm telling you, this is straight from Cooper. Just memorize it. Cooper says IOA needs to be obtained a minimum of 20% of sessions, days, whatever, preferably between 25% and 33%. So preferably every 3 or 4 times data is collected, we should obtain IOA data. The more IOA, the better, right? Because the more we can ensure we're tracking everything right, we're implementing everything correctly, we're in agreement, okay? But at minimum, we need 20%, preferably between 25 and 33%. 166, a behavior analyst wants to develop a plan to manipulate the MO for socially mediated tangible reinforcement. Which of the following interventions would be best for the analyst to use? Stop. Questions like this especially becomes very important that we don't just jump to the answer choices. Look at all the information we have in the question and look at how long all these answer choices are. You're going to spend so much time jumping back and forth. If you just jump right to the answer choices, you're going to waste so much time. Ignore the answer choices and let's just think about the question. The question wants to know, which of the following interventions should we use? We are trying to develop an intervention to manipulate a motivating operation for socially mediated tangible reinforcement. So if we're going to manipulate MO, we're either trying to establish or abolish its reinforcement, okay? So immediately we should start thinking deprivation and satiation of a socially mediated tangible reinforcement. Now we have some guidance. Now we have an idea of what we're looking for. So now let's get to our answer choices and see if we can look for deprivation, satiation, tangibles, right? A, whenever the client engages in maladaptive behavior, follow through with the task demand given before the behavior occurred. What's wrong with A? Well, following through with the task demand is not going to help us with tangible functions, right? That's going to be escape function. And again, it's going to be a consequence. Manipulating the MO is the antecedent. A is out. B, provide attention to the client every 3 minutes, regardless of what the client is doing at the time. This sounds to me like non-contingent reinforcement. Non-contingent reinforcement is a type of antecedent intervention. If we're providing attention, what are we trying to manipulate? Attention function. We are looking at the tangible function. B is out. C, allow access to the client's preferred tangible every 5 minutes throughout the session. All right, another non-contingent reinforcement procedure, antecedent procedure, manipulation of the MO procedure. But this time we're allowing access to what? Tangible. That's the function we're trying to meet. C checks all of our boxes. We're manipulating the MO. It's an antecedent and it fits the function. D, deliver punishment immediately whenever the client engages in tantrum behavior when a preferred tangible is removed. This one should be an immediate cross off. This is a consequence. We're looking at manipulating MOs. D is out. Answer here is going to be C. Becomes very easy if you do all your work up front, right? Do the work up front. Pretend answer choices aren't even there. We're just looking at the question. Try to predict the answer. 167. Two brothers are sitting across the table from each other. The first brother sees a dog and says, dog. The second brother says, wolf. The first brother's behavior represents a blank. Again, read carefully. What is the question asking about? The question is asking about the first brother's behavior. What do we know the first brother did? First brother saw a dog. He said dog. What does that represent? Well, it's a verbal operant evoked by a nonverbal SD. He's labeling the dog. The first brother engaged in the tact. What if they said, what does the second brother's behavior represent? Well, the second brother's behavior was evoked by the first brother's verbal SD. There is no point-to-point correspondence, but there is formal similarity. It would be an interverbal. It's not a man because it doesn't seem like there's any motivating operation at play, and it's evoked by a nonverbal SD. And then it's not an echoic because he's not copying a verbal SD. The first brother behavior represents a tact. The hardest part about this question is identifying that we're talking about the first brother and not the second brother. If a verbal operant is evoked by both a motivating operation and a nonverbal stimulus, it is considered a blank. Okay, another one you just kind of want to know, be aware of. In this case, we know it's evoked by a motivating operation. Typically, that would be a mand, but it's also evoked by a nonverbal stimulus. So if it's evoked by both, it can't be a mand, right? A mand is simply evoked by a motivating operation. If it's evoked by a motivating operation and a nonverbal stimulus, well, it can't be a tact because the tact is just a nonverbal. It's not an echoic because it's verbal. It has to be an impure tact. Now, you just need to know that. But again, you can get there by asking yourself, well, a mand is not evoked by a nonverbal stimulus. It's evoked just by a motivating operation. A tact is evoked just by a nonverbal stimulus. So putting those two together, it has to be an impure tact, B. Which of the following is false about the changing criterion design? Let's think about changing criterion designs. Remember, we're trying to think through our questions. What do you know about changing criterion designs? Well, we can increase or decrease. The behavior has to be in the client's repertoire. If we want to establish a functional relation, we have to change our criterion to a previous level. We don't need a baseline. Okay, here's our changing criterion, right? So we're looking for something false about the changing criterion design.